Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games. I'm Lee, and in this video I'll show you how I painted the IMMOLATOR miniature from Scions of the Flame. Here's our IMMOLATOR all primed, and for the prime paint I used a Citadel colour Wraithbone and assembled with the Citadel plastic glue. And the brush I used for most of this video is the Wargamer character brush by Army Painter. Let's get this awesome miniature painted to a tabletop battle ready standard. First I used the Ceramite White by Citadel, and this is a base paint, and here I just went over all the flames just to give them a brighter base to paint on, and that's going to just give it a little subtle difference to the rest of the model. I also went over some of the areas that I didn't quite prime properly, and so I was being very careful with the spray not to put it on too heavily, so there were some areas that needed a little bit more, so I just touched those up with this white base paint. And I guess you could use any good base paint for this. Wraithbone would be perfect, but I didn't have any at the time. When that had completely dried, I took some contrast medium and contrast Guilliman flesh, and I mixed those together. I used equal parts contrast medium to equal parts Guilliman flesh, and then mixed that together thoroughly. So I didn't want the flesh to be too bold, and then I started applying that to all the areas where the flesh was exposed, but not on the areas that I wanted to use for flame later on. I'm putting this on quite heavily here, and I'm just starting in the recesses with the brush loaded with paint, and so that's where I want most of the paint to build up. But then I'm also moving that contrast paint around, guiding it where I want it to be the darkest, and then ending my brush strokes also where I want more of the paint to pool. Where it was starting to build up on the more raised areas that are going to get the most highlight, I just used my brush to wick it away and then move that paint into the other more darker recesses and areas that I wanted that shadow to be a lot deeper. The contrast paint doesn't dry that quickly, so you've got plenty of time to move it around where you want it, but once it's settled, you've got to leave it alone. Once that flesh had dried, I took some contrast Yandin yellow, Gryph-hound orange and Flesh Tearer red, and this is going to be for our flame. And here I'm doing a wet blend technique, so I've got all my paints open and ready to go at the same time. I want to be quick to go from one colour to the next, so I didn't want to be playing around with the pots trying to open them. And I've put one coat of yellow all over the flame, and you want to get 100% almost of the flame covered, but just leave a tiny bit white where the flame meets the flesh and the other materials. Again, I'm being quite generous with this paint and applying it to all the areas, starting where I want the thickest of the shade and ending my brush strokes where I want the paint to pool. What I've done here on this model, because there's so much flame, it's such a cool model, completely covered in flames really, so I've divided it up into sections. So I did 3 sections at a time, and although the contrast paint takes a little while to dry, I still didn't want to do it all in one go and risk it not blending properly. So I split it into 3 sections, and here I'm just working on one section for the example in this video. This is a really simple technique with the contrast paints, and for a tabletop battle ready standard, I think this just works really well. If you want something more advanced, there's some amazing videos and creators out there, but for the level I'm at right now, this is about my limit, and I was really happy with it. Now I'm going straight in with the orange, and while that yellow paint is still wet, I'm starting from the tip of the flame and working my way down, covering about 60 to 65% in orange. I want quite a dark flame for this, and I think that'll contrast really well against those awesome turquoise scales that they wear. So I'm going for 60 to 65% of orange. And once I put the first bit of orange on, I'm going quite heavy with the brush, it's loaded up. And the same thing, ending the brush strokes in the recesses where I want the darkest parts of the flame, but starting at the tip and working down where I can. For the smaller flames coming off those larger ones, I'm almost treating those as individual flames and keeping that ratio of 60 to 65% on those two. And then once you've got it on, it's just a case of working it in, mixing it with the yellow, and as you get down to the end of that 60-65%, just thinning it out and really mixing it with the yellow in those parts to create some paler tones and make that blend as smooth as you can with this kind of technique. That's the orange applied now, so it's time to move on to the red. And again, this is all still wet, so you can see how much time you've got to kind of work with this paint. It's really accommodating. And I'm taking the red, and now again I'm going from the tip of the flame, and I'm working my way down about 30% now. So we're going down the ratio, so I don't want too much red, but still quite a lot, and these flames are quite dark. You can do kind of any ratio you like. You can have it more yellow if you want, much more orange. It's really up to you for the effect you want and the colour scheme that you're going for. So many flames on this miniature, I was quite intimidated going into it, so I started on the other warband members first, and after getting the flame technique to a point I was happy at with those, I moved on to this guy then. So I didn't want to do him first and make a complete mess of it, so I started on the others and built my confidence up using the technique before I moved on to the Immolator. And I've got to say, I really like the contrast paints and how they blend together so nicely. And here we've put the 3 colours on now. You could stop there, but I just wanted to blend it a little bit more, and so what I do is I go back into the yellow and take a tiny bit on my brush, and then I start working in the area where the yellow and orange are faded together, and just fade that a little bit more and make it a little bit more gradual. And I do the same with the orange as well. And then the last step is to take some contrast black Templar, and this is going to go on the very tips of the flames just to signify where the flames turn into smoke. And I've only got a very small amount of paint on my brush here. I'm being really careful not to let that mix in too much, but just on the very tips. The next paint now is the contrast snakebite leather, and this is perhaps one of the best contrast paints in my opinion. With one coat you can get some awesome looking leather that leaves some brilliant highlights and some really nice deep shade, and it's such a great paint that goes on, I think, at just the right amount of colour. And this is going on all the leather parts, all the straps, the belt, and those guards, the armour guards on the shins there. So that's all going to be completely covered in a nice generous coat of snakebite leather. You can, if you want, once the first coat's dried, go in for a second coat. If you do it all over, I found it's really too dark and you lose a lot of the different contrasts between the highlights and the shadows. But if you just take a little bit and go in the more deeper, darker recesses, you can really get a nice shadow effect from doing that. So, but I've just left it with one coat here, and that was plenty. And it really works nice against that orange. Now we're back to the black Templar, and this is going to be for the boots, and one really thick, generous coat I put on here. And I've done on some of the other models of the warband, I put 2 coats on, but it was way too much and it didn't need it. So I just found one thick coat was enough for this, and that left a nice black leather effect. When I start work on my next warband, I really want to start doing some more pre-shades and highlights. And I've got to say thanks to Justin for leaving a comment on one of my other miniatures, kind of pointing that out and leaving a tip on how I could do that. I think a pre-shade with some highlights with this black Templar contrast paint over the top, I think it's going to look a lot better than what I've done on these models. So thanks for that, Justin, and I'll let you know when I've tried it out on my next models. I'd also like to say thanks to everyone for the awesome feedback I've received so far. I've been doing this now, 4 or 5 weeks with the channel, and I'm really grateful for everyone's support and great comments, and it's really brilliant to be part of such an awesome community of creators on YouTube, and I'm having such a great time, so thanks so much everybody. Right, let's get back to the model. So that black's going on now, nice and thick on all the boots, and then we're going to move on to the next stage, which is to take the contrast basilicanum grey, and this is going to be for the trousers. And again, this is one coat, and I'm being quite generous and starting where I want the paint to be the darkest, and also ending my stroke where I want it to be the darkest. And where it starts to build up over the more lighter raised areas, I just take my brush, I wipe it on some kitchen towel if need be to dry it a little bit, and then wick away the paint from the raised areas. I think this grey, this basilicanum grey, works really well against the black Templar. I thought they'd clash quite a bit perhaps, but they're kind of different enough to work together when painted closely together like we have here. I'm being really careful as well not to go over the flames and the areas of the leather that I've already painted. So I'm trying to get quite a fair bit of paint on the brush, but not too much where it's going to go out of control and kind of spread around. But it's really nice to work with, and I'm just moving it where I want it, taking my time. I'm not in any rush to get these models painted. I'm really enjoying the process and just guiding that contrast paint and learning how much of it to put on, how much I can move it. And I think by the time you've done a few models, you soon get used to how it kind of runs and how much you can get away with at each stage. While that's drying, we're going to move on to the next stage, which is to take some teredon turquoise contrast, and this is going to be for those really cool scales that they've taken, I imagine, from the beasts, the fire-breathing beasts that they've killed out in the plains and out in the desert area that they come from. And this is a really beautiful colour that goes on nice and thick, and I really love the vibrancy of it. And I'm putting this on really thick, and I'm starting again in the recesses where different materials are going to meet and cast shade on each other, really working it in amongst all the scales and letting that paint do the work for me. Having this really nice turquoise colour is perfect to go with the orange, red and yellow of the flames, so those kind of opposing colours are a perfect match. And I really loved how it was coming together here, and kind of once you put that turquoise on, it brought all the members of this warband to life, and it looks really great. With this contrast paint, we're going to be adding 2 highlights to it later on in the video, so out of all the others we didn't need to, but this one really benefits from a highlight. The next step, I wanted to tidy up anywhere where I'd gone over any other parts of the model, so I took that ceramite white again and I just put it on anywhere I'd kind of made a mistake and painted on the mask here. Also, I went over on the material that comes off the belt, so I'm just touching those bits up. The thing with contrast paints is if you try and cover up a previous mistake, you can still see it coming through, especially if you're putting a light colour over a dark, it's really going to show up. So it's important to just be as tidy as you can, but easy enough at these stages here where you can still see that primer, just to touch it up with some base paint. So with that done, we took some orange, Gryph-hound orange, and this is going to be for that really cool material that's got loads of creases, and I think this is the sort of parts of the models that really work well with contrast paints. This is probably the area I put the most paint on. I've really loaded that brush up and gone in thick, and you can see it already pooling there on the folds, and I really love the rich shadows you get from this. But it also, with the sharp lines and curves of this piece of the miniature, the highlights pop through really nicely. And again, it's just being patient and guiding it where you want it to go, forcing it into the recesses, ending your brush stroke where you want it to pull the most, and wicking it away from the raised areas that you want the most of the highlight to be on. You could just leave this orange, but we're going to put like a kind of glaze over it with another red contrast paint later on, because I think the orange was just too much against the flame. It didn't work, so it really needs to be red, and it'll also look a lot more like the models that you see pictured in the Catacombs rulebook. And then while that was drying, it was time to make the highlight. So with some white, dark green and dark blue, all by Vallejo, and you could use any dark blue or dark green for this. I mixed the white, blue and green together with an old scruffy brush and gave it a really good mix together to make a dark teal. And then I took some white with a bit of that teal and made a lighter version of it. And then this is going to be our 2 highlights. So I loaded the brush up, but then got most of the paint off in some kitchen towel, and that's really important to have that brush as dry as you can get it. And then I was going over with the darker of the 2 highlights and going over all those scales, just being really careful not to hit any of the areas that I'd already painted. And here I'm always going down as much as I can in a downward stroke, just to kind of hit the more raised areas. Once that first highlight was done, I took the lighter of the 2 paints and went over it again, and you can see here I've messed up. I've gone over on the belt and I've put that teal highlight on the leather belt, so we're going to have to go and sort that out later. But it's really important between each stages here that you let that paint dry completely. But these highlights really add to that contrast and really make that pop, I think. Outside of the world of Warcry, I work in illustration and design, and I've really learned when I was learning to draw that highlights don't have to be really light or white, and you can see here just how dark the 2 highlights we've used are, but on the palette they look completely different than they do in the model. So you can see here you've got that dark teal base and then the 2 highlights, but when you look at the model up close, that looks almost white, but it really isn't. The highlights are quite dark. Now we're going to take some of that snakebite leather and just tidy up that mistake I made earlier on, and I'm kind of, because it's quite light compared to the brown, I was just seeing if I could get away with just putting the contrast paint back over it, and it did work. So I didn't have to take it down with a layer of like white or wraithbone base paint and then start again. I could get away with just going over it, but it did make it a lot darker than the other section of the belt, so I had to give all the belt another coat of the snakebite leather, but I tried to leave the most raised areas with no extra paint on them, and then that gave us a kind of look of an edge highlight almost. So we got a free edge highlight from that previous mistake, so happy days. There are, and I'm just going in that dark section there as well, but that's all tidied up now, and so it was time to move on to the next stage. And for the next stage I took the contrast technical medium and some contrast flesh terror red, and then I mixed those together, and I've taken 4 parts contrast medium to 2 parts flesh terror red and gave that a really good mix. And this is going to go over that orange cloth that we did earlier, and I didn't want to put just straight flesh terror red on it because that would just cancel out all the orange. So I wanted to like wet it down and have it kind of thin and see-through enough so that we'd still get that orange coming through but have a more red, deeper, darker tone to the whole piece. I really want to experiment a little bit more with this kind of glaze effect and just play around with the ratios of contrast medium to paint. But I think this worked quite well, and it got us a nice deep colour that matches the same effect that they've got, or similar to the effect they've got in the Catacombs book. What I was being careful with here, while I was still loading my brush and working it into the recesses, I was trying to leave the most uppermost highlights without any of this red on there, and I was trying to get that orange to come through as an edge highlight. And you can see here it's worked a little bit on the edge there. I was really happy with how this one turned out. With that done, we're now moving on to the metalwork. So I've got some base paint, some lead belcher, and I'm going to cover every part of the model that is metal, and whether it's going to be gold or silver at the end, I'm still giving it a base coat of the lead belcher. That's all the braids done. Then I moved on to the mask and made sure that had a nice coat covering all that white paint up. Once all that metalwork was painted, I left it dry really thoroughly until I moved on to some Nuln Oil shade, and then I applied this all over the mask and all the silver parts of the metal, so there's braided pieces at the front and back. Instead of Nuln Oil, you could use the black Templar contrast paint for this, and you could either put it on straight from the pot if you want it nice and heavy, or you can wet it down with some of the contrast medium to give different effects, and it works really well to give a cool metallic look using the contrast paints. And I learned that from the terrain, that once you put a lead belcher base and then start applying all different colours, even Gilliman flesh works really well as brass, then you can get some really nice metallic effects. And even for coloured armour, you could use like blues and yellows, and it works really nicely. Before that Nuln Oil dried, I moved on to the Agarus Dunes contrast, and I wanted to mix a little bit of this in, almost like a wet blend, with that shade on the mask to give more of a gold, brassy, bronzy look, but making it a bit dirty. You got all that smoke from the flames, so I wanted that to kind of look, I didn't want it too clean and shiny. I didn't think that would work, so I just applied that to the mask there, and I really liked how that came out. And on the back of the head as well, he's got this kind of thing holding the mask on, so I covered that with the Agarus Dunes. And then I just checked over just to see those little attachments that are on there. There's a couple of ones there that need to be brass on the side, so I just gave those a little bit of Agarus Dunes as well. And then I let that dry thoroughly before going on to some nice silver 0.997 from Vallejo, and this is going to give us a highlight to all our metal, and whether it's silver, brass or gold, I'm using the same silver. I did use a gold highlight on some of the other models, but I just really like the way this silver gives it a sharper highlight against the gold and just mixes things up a little bit with a little bit extra contrast. And I'm just going over the kind of mask here, getting those raised areas on the cheeks, the nose and the forehead mainly, and you can see I'm kind of trying to do downward strokes with my brush just so it hits the raised areas more and doesn't sneak into the shadows where I want them to look really like dark and dirty. And then once the mask's highlighted, I do exactly the same thing on the other metal and the back on those braids, and I go over those, pulling my brush down, giving the downward strokes, catching the raised areas and highlighting the piece. I used the Vallejo silver because that's the only one I had, but you could certainly use Citadel brighter silvers and gold for your highlight. But here's our finished piece. We're going to let that dry, and then we'll take a look at him and see what he looks like once all the paint's dry, and we can really see how that contrast paint has worked out. I was really happy with how this finished up, and there's some areas I've still got to touch up where I went over and just got a little bit too much colour on some of the other areas, but overall I was really happy with how the Immolator finished up. If you'd like to see how I painted some of my other models, I've got 6 different Scions of the Flame on my YouTube channel with detailed videos like this going into how I painted it. the techniques I've used here can be applied to all those models, and so that'll work no problem, the same colours and everything. I've also done a separate video on how to paint just the fire and flame in this simple technique with contrast paints. I'll put links in the description to all the paints I've used, and those are affiliate links that go to Element Games, and they don't cost you anything extra. In fact, they're going to save you up to 20% if you purchase through them, and any purchases made, I get a small commission, and that's going to help me develop the channel and do a lot more content like this, and battle reports and things like that, and I really appreciate that support. I've also made some separate videos on how to make the bases that the Scions of the Flame are on, and so you can see how I made that red rocky kind of wasteland base. And I've also done another video on how you can fix your miniatures to the bases if you choose to paint them separately. So let me know what you think about the Scions of the Flame and the contrast paints in the description below. I'd love to hear your opinion, and if you've been painting for a long time and got any cool tips like Justin and some of the other brilliant comments I've got, please add them below. I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much for watching the video. Please like if you like it, subscribe for more content like this, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to join me next time on Tabletop Skirmish Games.